Welcome to this session for Climate Week, where we're going to be talking about behaviour change and climate. We've got two great speakers. I'll introduce them just before their talks. My name's Clive Mitchell. I work for Scottish Natural Heritage on strategy development. I also lecture for the Open University on environmental courses and system sciences. I'm on the advisory group for Scotland for WWF, and I'm also a steering group member for the Sustainable Scotland Network, which is why I'm here today primarily. So we're very glad to be hosted here at the Keep Scotland Beautiful offices. As I say, part of the Sustainable Scotland Network, which works for professionals working on climate change and sustainable development across the public sector in Scotland. As part of Climate Week, there are 128 organisations registered this year to raise awareness and action around climate change. In this webinar, the way it'll be structured is that we'll have two speakers. Catherine Happer will speak for 20 minutes, followed by 10 minutes of direct questions for her. We'll lead primarily from the stuff that's coming through from the webinar for those of you who are watching online, so get busy emailing us with your questions. The address is on the webinar page, ssn@keepscotlandbeautiful.org. Then Andrew will speak for 20 minutes with 10 minutes for questions for him, and then we'll have a kind of 30-minute at the end open discussion drawing on the content from both speakers. So yesterday, as part of Climate Week, there was a webinar featuring led by Chris Stark from Scottish Government, where he focused on production of emissions and the issues associated with trying to reduce those, particularly around, for example, housing and buildings and heating in particular. So today we're moving on to consumption and hence behaviour change. And so I'm delighted to start by introducing Catherine Happer from Glasgow University. She's a lecturer in sociology and does most of her work through the Glasgow University Media Group, focusing around public attitudes, beliefs and media, especially in relation to climate change. She was previously a programme maker for the BBC, and I'll let her say much more now. Thank you.
To play my part in Climate Week, which I've noticed does have a specific objective of inspiring action on climate change. So even though I'm going to map out all of the very real challenges that we face, I'll very much try as well to offer some words of positive encouragement too. So I've been exploring for the last maybe 6-7 years this question, this persistent conundrum, if you like, that in spite of a widespread recognition of the importance of climate change and a broad awareness of the science, we see this kind of tendency towards what's sometimes called stealth denial. So this is the fact that most people, when it comes to their own behaviours, when it comes to the kind of parties that they want to vote for, they disengage. So people care about climate change, but they don't care quite enough. And what we haven't seen is any collective commitment to tackle the problem. So why is that the case? Well, it's complicated, which is the kind of answer you'd expect from an academic. The dimension I'm most interested in is the media, although as you'll see, that's not all I talk about, because I see media and communications as being just one part, albeit an integral part, of a whole circuit in which politicians, corporate actors, scientists, experts, then meeting with the industry and journalists and the general public all interact dynamically to construct the range of possible outcomes that we might see. So it's not to say that the media simply promote messages of the powerful and we all absorb it. We know that's not the case, don't we? We don't just believe everything that we read. Audiences do have a degree of agency to resist media messages. But of course, when the same messages are continually reinforced, that becomes much, much more difficult. So my argument is that you have to kind of look at the whole circuit to understand the struggle over meaning, the struggle over outcomes. Why are some people predisposed to accept these arguments and reject others? How do those interpretations relate to the choices that they make? And how do the choices that we make relate to the big decisions that get made in society? Okay, so to come back to climate change then, as I said, I've done a lot of work on this in the last 6-7 years. mainly in the UK. Obviously, I've done a lot of work in Scotland as well. And in the last couple of years, I've also done some international work, so work in China, Brazil, and the US. And I find the differences in responses to these questions around climate change really, really illuminating. So when we're mapping out the social, cultural, and attitudinal environments in which climate change is made meaningful, what we find is those understandings relate not only to local experiences, but also the priorities of the particular media cultures. So in China and Brazil, climate change really isn't in the media all that much, not half as much as it is here. And I know we are starting at a kind of low level there actually, because climate change isn't in the media here all that much either. But in China and Brazil, connections, because they're not so reliant on media, are made across lived experiences, the kind of social interactions that they have, the conversations that they have, and all of the rest of it, and other sources of information, including what they learn at school. In China, a very strong association is with pollution. I've got a little picture here of a girl with a mask on. You've probably seen these pictures. In China, in the inner city areas, they often have to wear masks because the pollution is so thick, the haze, as they call it. It's a very, very real problem. It's top of mind to people. In Brazil, again, a very key theme is deforestation. So in China and Brazil, you know, it's a sense that climate change is something which is having a very direct, a very tangible, very negative impacts on health and well-being. Now, in the UK and the US, just get some water. In the UK and the US, climate change is a much more remote issue. People don't relate it to experience. When we ask people to talk about what they think of when they think of climate change, they say things like, it's a debate that goes on, it's a dispute, there's vested interests involved, there's a confusion, it's indecision. So in the most basic terms, climate change over here is something which is experienced. Climate change here is something which is talked about. It's something which is theorised about. It's something that can be questioned. So this is not a simple argument that scepticism in our media leads directly to scepticism in the general public, because as I'm sure you know, here in the UK and Scotland, not so much in the US because it's a slightly different picture actually, but that outright denial, that real scepticism, actually it's a marginal position. But what we do have is a very conflicted media environment. So for every voice telling us that we should be concerned about climate change, there's another voice telling us, actually, we can relax and we don't have to think about it and we don't have to worry about it. So a few years ago, I think it was 2014, when the IPCC released their latest report, which was making the boldest statement yet on the very real challenges that we face, Channel 4, for example, ran with, is the IPCC alarmist on climate change? So it's perhaps not surprising then that even those people who do say that they have a very strong belief in anthropogenic climate change do carry around a lot of doubt, a lot of hesitation, a kind of persistent voice at the back of their head saying, why should we prioritise an issue around which there's such conflict, there's such complexity? And I think in many ways, to me, climate change is emblematic of what I think is probably the biggest problem that we face in political debate in the West right now. And this, and I don't know if you all feel this, but I certainly think it's very widespread, is a general crisis in public trust. We don't trust politicians, we don't trust journalists, we don't trust experts, and yet they're all speaking at us at once. And so, as one of our participants said, I think this is a really good quote, and I do use it because I think it sums up very well. I think it's because we're exposed to so many opinions from people, and a lot of the time it's conflicting opinions. You don't know who to believe, so it's a case of believing nothing instead of believing anything. Really quite damning, powerful quote there, I think. Every time I read it, I go, where do we go from there? But in China and Brazil, climate scepticism in the media doesn't exist. Our participants don't use these phrases, they don't have these hesitations about taking action. But I think as well, because they make those connections with their lived experience, they also have a much richer visual language to draw on. So, how many of you have seen this image here before? This one here. Is that a familiar image? No? Yes? Never seen it before? It's quite familiar. You would be amazed how many times this image accompanies an article on any aspect of climate change, online, in the British press, even on TV news. I collect articles on climate change. I've got hundreds of these. And I did a little test before I came here on Google Images, put in climate change. It's the first one that comes up. That's the image we see all of the time. Now, does that image inspire you to go out and do anything? Does it? It doesn't inspire me to go and do anything. But the point is, where are we in this picture? Where are we? We're not in this picture at all. There are no people in this picture at all. We just don't figure. And as one research participant said to me, everyone thinks it's someone else's problem. And I think that's a really key point, and it brings me to the question that I was talking to someone in the audience about before. You know, this is a question, whose problem, whose responsibility do we actually see climate change to be? Do we feel that individuals have a role at all in this? And I get conflicting findings on this point in my focus groups. So I'd say we live in a society which has a very strong ideology of individualism. So if we have this sense that we have free choice, we're individuals, we have quite a lot of agency. But to exercise that choice, we're constantly in competition with other people. So we're in competition with people for the best skills, for the best jobs, for the best university places, for the best healthcare. It's how we survive. We're forced to think like this. And when you start to think like this, the conclusion becomes, well, if they're going to be selfish, I'm going to be selfish too. You think, I'm going to not try for the best school in the area and put in that placing request. If I don't do it, the kid next door is going to get that. We're forced to think like that. And I think changing our behaviours on climate change requires us almost to kind of step outside our immediate self-interest. It weakens our competition for what's been constructed as scarce resources. So if we do the school run, and the school walk I should say, not the school run, take the school walk, not the school run. If we take the school walk, we might arrive for work 10 minutes later than our colleague every day. Now, that might not do us any good in a very competitive workplace. If we take the train to London for that meeting and we don't get the flight, again, same applies. What if we don't have the big showy car? I'm not saying this applies to anybody in this room, obviously, but it might apply to some people. Is that going to affect my status? So we lose our edge on other people. It's a form of powerlessness to be here. It's a kind of a let's do nothing position. Everybody's selfish. What's the point in doing anything? So through these conversations in my focus groups then, participants, when we start to kind of break it down like that, they eventually come to the point where they say, well, actually, our lives really aren't all that free. We're not really so free, are we? Our lives are structured in ways which limit our choices, which shape our behaviours. And in the US, when I did some work recently on meat consumption, we'd start the conversations with nanny state, that's more a British phrase, but the similar idea, I don't think that gets used in America, but similar idea, telling us what to do, telling us what to eat, we don't want that. Then the conversations kind of move around to, hang on a minute, but actually our lives have been structured in ways by governments, by business, which have steered us towards these really awful diets. They've made us unhealthy. We had no choice. So we've been very, very limited because the health food store is 4 miles away and actually the burger joint's right on our doorstep. So our lives have been structured in ways which really limit our choices and steered us towards the bad choices that we've made, not really choices at all. So to make change then, we can't do it alone. And it's often at these points where groups go from, we can't tackle climate change, it's too difficult, to, why aren't governments doing more? We can change, but we need help. We need that support, we need that structural support. So awareness becomes empowerment and it becomes a call to do something. So working backwards then, thinking about the points I've made about media and my international comparisons, I've come up with 3 steps which I think are very important in laying the foundation for potential behavioural change. And I'm watching my wording there, potential behavioural change. Remember though, I think in Scotland it's really, really important to say, probably not the case in the US and maybe even less across Britain, you're starting from a base of very sympathetic attitudes. So a lot of people have commitments that they'd really like to carry out, but actually they've found it very difficult to do that for a whole number of reasons. So for some it's just that kind of final push. So the 3 steps I've come up with, and you can challenge me on these, please do. The first is to connect the issue more with people's lived experience. Really important, I think, that it becomes about them. Secondly, cement the belief that taking action is meaningful, that it's going to make a difference. And this third one, and it's crucially important, provide structural support. So that's obviously in the form of removing barriers such as cost and convenience. I really, really strongly think it's also in the form of particular policies introduced by governments, which, like taxing, for example, which might promote or discourage particular forms of behaviour. So finally then, in this context, how might media and communications help? Okay, I mentioned imagery. Really important, I think, for people to connect with that. Let's bring us back into the picture. Let's bring lives that we recognise back into the picture. There's an organisation called Climate Outreach, which does lots of brilliant work. Look them up, they're very, very good. Looking at the kinds of images that might trigger people to make behavioural changes. And what they find is that the more relatable, the more doable, the better. So for example, sounds like a very unsexy image, but a picture of a man insulating his loft, rated very highly. Things like that. But from our research as well, what are those kind of cultural associations that provoke very strong emotional responses? So what's the equivalent of pollution? What's the equivalent of deforestation? One theme that does come out in our research right across the board is people have a real revulsion towards images which show disruption to the countryside, which an attack on our kind of valued landscapes. So for example, when we see pictures, fields crammed with cows and things for food production or that kind of thing, people really don't like that. And it's not even just that it makes them angry, that just doesn't look right. That's just not right, that shouldn't be happening. And we can build on that sense of anger, that sense of that's not right, that just doesn't feel right, we don't want to see that. Those images, I think, actually can be fairly powerful. On messengers, right, Michael Gove I don't fully agree with on this. I don't think we've had enough of experts, and I think scientists always pull very, very highly when it comes to trust. But there's no question he was tapping into something with that. And what he was tapping into was that we are living in an era of real suspicion of elites and we don't want distant groups telling us what to do. Whether or not you agree with Brexit, I feel he was probably tapping into something. So what's the alternative to that then? If these distant groups maybe we're not so trusting of, it's getting closer to us, people who are closer to us. And our research shows that peer messengers operating online can be very, very, very powerful. So social media, for all of its faults, and I think it has lots and lots and lots and lots, can be a very useful vehicle for promoting collective sentiment, a kind of public sentiment. I don't know about you, but sometimes if I'm not sure what I think about something, I go on to Twitter and I think, what are all those people I know and trust and respect saying on this? And it will steer my opinion, it does. I think it does for all of us. We're looking for some sort of guide. So social media can actually play a positive role. I usually say terrible things about social media, but I think it does. I think in different ways we can maybe use it. And the other thing that's worthwhile bearing in mind is that governments obsessively monitor social media in all of its forms. I met with the communications, very briefly, strangely, the communications director for David Cameron last year, and he wanted to speak to all of our students because he wanted to know were they using Periscope, Twitter, Facebook. He really wanted that information. They are watching it all of the time. I don't know if the Scottish Government does it so obsessively, but they are looking at that as a gauge of public opinion. Now, I would argue it's a real distortion of public opinion for a whole variety of different reasons, but what it does mean is that what gets said on there matters. That kind of collective heat, the petitions, all the rest of it, they're watching, they're listening to what we say, and that's where they're going to find out what's getting said and what the general public think. So, to take a practical example, I don't know how many of you know about the divestment programme, or aware of the divestment programme, a global initiative which my university signed up to divest money from fossil fuel companies. And in my university, certainly, it was led completely by the students. They got the academics on board, I helped out where I could, but I wasn't involved in running the campaign, not whatsoever. They did it. And the way they did it, they built their support online. Again, they used what young people this is their world, they use it, that's how they do it. But the result is that we have these very large, very influential companies sending out a message that it's no longer acceptable to be accepting profit from fossil fuel companies. So if governments aren't doing it, we can do it ourselves. So what can the public sector do, collectively and individually, that sends out that message? This is how we're doing things now. We're not going to do things like that anymore. It's not acceptable. And also, of course, very importantly, supporting those behaviour changes as well. So who might the leaders in your organisation be? How can they use online to build support for behaviour change? So just finally then, my view is, I really have a strong belief that governments, even the Scottish Government, who I think do well in a lot of these things, they do well in trust and they obviously are tackling climate change very, very seriously. But I think governments do tend to overestimate the level of resistance that there is to intervention in people's lives on climate change. In fact, what I would argue and what my research would show is that when these messages are set out in a way which engage people, actually even quite radical solutions aren't just accepted, they're actually expected. And when people argue that the individual doesn't matter or individual action doesn't matter when it comes to climate change, well, where do those expectations come from? Those expectations come from the kinds of things that we are willing to do, the changes that we are willing to make, which then creates expectations of the people at the top. So I'm not arguing that you can go out and change your light bulb and we tackle climate change. I really wish that was the case. I wish that was the message I could say today. We all know that's not the case. But I really do believe that in the individual, and particularly individuals working together as a collective, can make a difference. So there is a cycle of information, good messaging, good effective messaging, collective response, often voting with our feet, perhaps going online, making changes to our own behaviour, signing petitions, and from that it creates the expectation that governments will respond. That's how change happens. So the top, they'll have to do it, but it's got to come from the bottom too. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. That was a fantastic introduction to the discussion today. Looking at my email, it looks quite dry there at the moment from the webinar site. So yeah, if for those of you online, please email your questions in, and we'll pick them up. I mean, there were some brilliant themes there around structure and agency and meanings that you touched on. I'm sure Andrew will be picking up on those as well. But were there any questions from the people in the audience here arising from Catherine's talk? We've got a microphone which you must use so the people on the webinar can hear what you're saying if you've got a question. If not, I'll ask one. Yeah.
Thanks. You think that the big difference between the undeveloped countries like China and Brazil of their attitude about climate change has something to do that they are the ones suffering the consequences and not the Europeans, for example?
I think that's absolutely the case, but then I think if we look at the US, there's no question that the US is also a region right now which is particularly now suffering the consequences. So there's no question there is a sense that there are very real impacts, but there's also the thing I'm most interested in, obviously, is the way in which those impacts are interpreted and then the way in which the public respond to it. So I think the difference is that in the US at the moment there's a very polarised political culture, and what tends to happen, and it's also the case I think in Britain, I think there's been a concerted failure on the part of the Western media to make the connections with extreme weather events such as flooding. So I know that the evidence and the science can link a climate change to any direct event, any hurricane or any extreme weather event individually, but actually they do know that it's exacerbating these events and also making them more frequent. But the problem is, in the West, and this happens here in Britain, although we're not suffering the consequences, but certainly in the US they are, they continually report on these and the connection with climate change isn't made at all. So actually the interpretation, some of it is there's what's happening, the way I see it anyway, it's what's happening and the kind of experiences we have, and then the ways in which those different sources of information interpret and provide interpretations
for us of what's happening. And I think in the US is a very good example. It's absolutely worked to do the opposite, and it's become a political issue. But actually the impacts there are very, very real. So I agree with the general point. You're absolutely right. In Britain at the moment, certainly we aren't experiencing such extremes of weather or pollution and deforestation and things. But at the same time, I think it's the way in which those events are interpreted and the way in which we then, receive and respond to those interpretations. So yes, I mean, I agree, but I do think there's a genuine problem in the US at the moment as well.
Sorry to interrupt you. But I would say that the US, the problem is because corporations are so strong in the US, and they have this fear about the nanny state, that the people who are suffering the consequences are the people who are in the bottom.
Yes.
Therefore, they don't have the same importance, and corporations are managing to, take the attention away from the problem.
Yes. Oh, there's no question we're talking about very different political systems there, clearly. And here, I mean, different. We have a democracy, but I'd say we have a very, very dysfunctional democracy. And what you do have is you have a concerted group at the top, and what we increasingly see is the political class, the business class, the journalist class, actually they're all drawn from the same group. We have a really concerted group of very powerful people at the top, and there's no question that one of the reasons the media has been so conflicted on climate change is not just because of, broadcasting conventions around balance. It's because the oil and gas industry has invested billions and billions and billions of dollars in all sorts of different ways in setting up think tanks which are presented as independent researchers on our media and speak alongside experts such as scientists. So you're absolutely right. I mean, we were talking, I was talking about my research at a seminar, and we talked about, the sense that, we have a democracy here, and therefore you would imagine that information wouldn't be stifled in the way that, say, it would be in the Chinese system, because that's what you expect of, obviously they do suffer from censorship. But actually the information there had been less distorted, whereas our information had been distorted by the market, whereas their distortions are by the government, the state. So actually, in some ways, our system, in this case, is probably even more damaging, which is a really interesting way of looking at it, I think. We have a democracy, but it's so dysfunctional, actually, it's almost not functioning at all. So I agree completely.
That's there's no questions online, so there's a question at the back which I'll come to in a minute, but I think I want to pick up on that point about power relations, which I think we'll come back to in the general discussion, because I think power relations define any set of social interactions, and they're important because they can get things done, and they're unavoidable, but they're problematic if they're not recognised. And in so many of the interactions that we have around climate change, state of nature, population health and so on, power relations are at play, but not acknowledged and not recognised. Sorry, so we'll come back to that in the discussion afterwards, I think. Question at the back.
Thanks, Catherine, for a very interesting presentation there. Communications are clearly important for messaging. They're important for organisations involved in trying to change behaviours. Can you perhaps look into the future and give us your interpretation of what the messaging might look like somewhere towards 2025 to 2030? What do you think we'll be seeing as key messages, and how will the media translate some of the challenges that might be more obvious by then?
Well, I think there's a really interesting thing that's happening at the moment, actually, coming back to the point about making the connections with extreme weather events. And I think there was at one point, and this actually, a lot of this came from the kinds of research that people like me do, there was a sense that alarmism around climate change was counterproductive. So there was a sense that if this maybe 5-6 years ago, if you talked about extreme weather events, if you talked about some of the real, the really quite radical challenges that we would be facing, people would disengage because it was so huge, it was so terrifying, actually, I don't want to go there with climate change. And I think maybe partly because of that and partly because of some of the other things we've been talking about, a lot of journalists felt, let's soften the message a little bit, let's move away from that alarmism and try something quite different. And actually, I think that's one of the reasons, amongst many other reasons, why they don't perhaps make the connections with flooding that they do. But what is happening now is that the expectation of those connections is coming from the public. To turn it on its head, that actually in the American public, you've got the mayors coming out. Okay, the politicians aren't talking about it. We've got Trump in place, and that's a problem in all sorts of different ways. But you've got mayors coming out, people speaking about this, online people talking about it, and what they're now saying is, hang on a minute, why are we not talking about this? Why are we not making these connections? How are we not facing up to this? So I think there almost becomes an expectation that they really have to talk about the very real challenges and the very real dangers that we'll face. I mean, in terms of what it'll look like in 20 to 30 years' time, that's very difficult, because I would say let's be optimistic about the mood for change, maybe, and how we might tackle this and what we might do, and I guess where we are in terms of the impacts and how much progress that we've made. But what I definitely think is that the shift I see occurring now is that, you know, the public were very, very much, you know, in the dark about some of these things, and they're no longer in the dark, and they understand it. Nobody fully understands climate change. It's far too complex. Nobody can ever understand it. We can only ever really have a partial understanding. But they are making demands of journalists. They are making demands, and they will start to make demands of people in power. So I think it will come, I genuinely do, from those connections being made, social media perhaps playing a role, and actually it creating an expectation that we talk about this very real, this very present, this very, you know, let's be honest, frightening threat that we face. So I think the messaging perhaps is going to change again. If you look at the messaging from 5-6 years ago, it was much more focused on this is where we might be, this is the horrible things we might face. And then, as I say, they were kind of softening the message a bit. And I think we are absolutely going to move back to this is the very real present. This is what we're facing. Look at these hurricanes. Look at the things that are going to happen. Look at the problems with global hunger, etc., etc. We're really going to have to face them dead on, and the public will expect that. And from that, I certainly hope we'll see some radical solutions, which I genuinely don't believe will have real resistance. Because when you frame messages in this is the alternative, nobody's going to argue against that. People don't resist interventions when they're framed in those ways. I think a very good example to me, I always use smoking as a very good example of how cultural change happens. So you had the science consolidating, a lot of smaller changes to the culture, like bans on advertising and so on, and eventually people starting to feel a little differently about smoking, and then the ban comes in. And actually there was almost a consensus. A few grumbling voices like Nigel Farage, but most people I think were on board with that because the evidence was so consolidated, it was so clear, there was such a clear argument, how could you argue against it? Now, I think the Scottish Government was very bold in the recent move to lower the drink driving level. There wasn't that level of consensus. We hadn't seen, there was a lot of grumbling, and I don't know if that was an argument that there was a consensus on, but when you frame it in, people's lives are at risk. This is a policy change that's saving people's lives. Who's resisting this now? You might grumble, you might not like it. Well, it's a bit of a pain in the neck. I can't drive to the pub 10 miles away for my Sunday lunch and have a pint of beer. But I don't hear grumbling about that, and people aren't going to resist that kind of intervention, because how can you argue against something that's framed, this is a threat of ecological disaster, we're saving the planet here, and we see it, and here are the effects. I think framed like that, which is, I believe, we're moving in that direction, I think, you know, we're not going to see much resistance to that kind of intervention.
Thanks. We've time for one more question before we have to move on to Andrew's talk, and then we'll come back for an open discussion at the end. And this question's online, so that's great. So thanks to Sarah for this, who's asking, Catherine, can you think of any examples of organisations in the UK or abroad who are doing a really good job of communicating the importance of personal agency in climate change actions?
Oh my goodness. I don't know if I do have an answer that immediately comes to mind, but that's maybe because I focus so much on the problems created by media. I don't know, I'll maybe leave that to somebody else to answer. I've got to say, it's a very, very good question, and it's maybe one I have to go away and think about. I think individual agency isn't something which is emphasised, because we have come back to this position where we say, actually turning off the lights, conserving energy, actually that's not going to make too much of a difference. And the shift has rightly, absolutely, moved towards organisations, governance, those groups in power. But I believe there is a very positive message on individual agency, and I have no doubt some organisations are doing it. So I just don't have an immediate answer. But
I mean, it's maybe something we'll come back to in the open session at the end. But I mean, it seems to me that the kind of the weighting of those messages sometimes switches from the individual, that sort of do a little, change a lot type of thing, to and then back to structure. But I think there are probably very few examples where the two have worked together, so that there's a kind of a drive for personal agency and action that's supported by relevant structural interventions to create the conditions to reinforce those behaviours. I think that's a really good question to open up in relation to the way that technology works in relation to some of these problems as well, and what kind of behaviours do the technology structural solutions provide, and the way that people then interact with those technologies. So let's
I think
come back
that's
to
the trick, is to get the balance right, and I'm not convinced. It's a very difficult balance to get right, I think.
And that's something that Andrew's going to talk about now.
Yes.
So let's move on to our second speaker. Andrew Darnton is an independent researcher who focuses an awful lot on behaviour change theory and practice for the UK government, for Scottish government, for the Welsh government, anyone who asks. And he's doing an awful lot of work from that really on system change. So I think picking up some of the themes that we've just been talking about. He's the architect of Scottish Government's ISM behaviour change model that looks at the way that individual actions interact with social conditions and the material world, the infrastructure and institutions that surround us to create behaviours, and where best to intervene within those systems to change behaviours on specific areas of behaviour change. He's also newly a fellow at Surrey University, where one of the things he's doing is looking at a project to value behaviours and networks and social systems. Andrew, I'm sure you're going to say much more about that in your talk.
Thanks. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to come. I get to go away. So I had the good fortune to develop this ISM model, which then the Scottish Government published in connection with their trajectory for decarbonising the economy. And so I did this thing, they published it, and I go away and it lives on, and then I come back and touch it occasionally, prod it, check that it's still moving, and go away again. But so it's a delightful thing to come back here where there's actually work being done, rather than just having to dwell in Brexit land all the time. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about ISM, the model, which, as Clive's mentioned, is a way for thinking about behaviours and helping groups of people work on behaviour change, come up with practical interventions grounded in theory. I'm going to talk about it in relation to the climate change plan. It's Climate Week. The climate change plan is sat in draft. It's had feedback and is now, I hope, being formalised. I think one of the comments was it could do with some more emphasis on behaviours. So I'm here to add my weight to it could do with more emphasis on behaviours. And I look forward to seeing the final version, I think, at the start of next year. So I'm talking about ISM in relation to the climate change plan, individuals, institutions, and ironies. Here we go. There's the draft climate change plan. Now, the climate change plan has two kind of strands to it. It talks about setting the carbon budget. How are we going to get to 2032? 66% emissions reductions by 2032. So this is the third slice of the journey to 2050. Right, so this is so I call this RPP3 because the first two slices were RPP1, RPP2, and this is now RPP3, 2017 to 2032. And there are two things going on in the plan. One is this high-level setting of budgets, of envelopes, using something called the UK Times model, the Scottish Times model, customised for Scotland, which is a whole system energy model that models the different scenarios for how we're going to hit those emissions. And the other wing of the plan is the one that goes on about transformational change, that we need transformational change in order to deliver those savings that have been projected using the Times model. And it's under the transformational change heading that behaviour change gets a considerable mention. And ISM is identified as a way, along with particularly the Climate Challenge Fund and Climate Conversations, of advancing behaviour change in Scotland. So it's worth thinking about these two things and how they sit together, and that's broadly what I'm talking about. the UK Times model, the Scottish Times model comes first. The budgets come first. And behaviour change is described as a means of ensuring people adopt and use infrastructural and technological measures. So the role of people is to take up the innovations and processes that are being developed, if you like, upstream. And good citizens will play their part in making sure that those produce the benefits. Yep, because you can leave your heating on and the windows open and all the energy goes out the window, clearly. The argument runs that because we're moving into this period from 2017 to 32, a load of the upstream stuff's already been done. Lots of the technological work. So we're beginning to have to think about what the corporates would call the end-use phase. Yeah, Unilever have taken all the carbon out of their supply chain. Now they need to worry about how much liquid you put in the washing machine, because that's where most of the carbon's going to. What you set, whether you wash at 30, quick wash, slow wash, that's where the carbon in their processes is now left, because they've sorted out their house, and they're now having to work with consumers. And I think this is where the government is getting to. The consumer. So if you like, we've done the quick wins, the low-hanging fruit, and now we're needing step ladders and sticks to bang the top of the tree. Yeah. And this means, therefore, that the individual becomes more and more prominent in the government's consideration. So behaviour change is looming, if you like, with greater urgency than before. But one of the first ironies we'll touch on today is that putting the spotlight onto the individual actually means throwing it back onto the system. Because as Catherine's nicely set up, lots of choices are non-choices. And as ISM will go on to show, behaviour change has always been beyond the individual, if you like. And when the government here first published ISM in 2013 in connection with RPP2, the guide that was written was called Influencing Behaviours, Moving Beyond the Individual. Right? So that was the RPP2 position, was, well, we need to think about behaviour change, but we need to think about going beyond the individual. And the question is, what's the RPP3 position on behaviour change, really? Yeah, rather than these two things. So we've got carbon budgets on the one hand and transformational change on the other. Okay, so what's the marriage between these two? So here are some suggestions, if you like, the beginnings of some suggestions for, I guess, what an ISM guide for RPP3 might look like. So I might just go and write the damn thing anyway, depending on how the plan looks. That's a promise as well as a threat, by the way. ISM has said, if you want to change your behaviour, first specify the behaviour. Yeah, but you know, saving energy in the home is not a behaviour. You know, boiling the correct amount of water in the kettle is a behaviour. Turning down your thermostat is a behaviour. Yeah. You need to be a bit granular about behaviours, and so saying we're going to achieve these savings through improving the energy efficiency of the housing stock still doesn't situate the individual within a process of change, right? The current climate change plan is dominated by the Times model and these envelopes, and certainly my experience of the process is that a lot of time spent on setting budgets and allocating them, and probably horse trading between different departments, which I'm not familiar with. And behaviour change is sort of going to be dealt with later, if you see what I mean. That we'll worry about that when we know what our numbers are. And what that means is that in terms of a behavioural focus, the plan talks about things like housing, transport and agriculture. I mean, this is how the model works. The Times model has lines for these things. So as you were saying yesterday, Chris Stark, as somebody was saying, spoke about their approach to Climate Week, which is very much the kind of setting envelopes approach. Yep, housing, transport, agriculture. What we might call the human or the citizen-centred approach is not really there. We might, as behaviours and practices people, talk about dwelling, travelling and eating. None of those things are in the plan, if you see what I mean. There is a page which looks an awful lot like 10 top tips, which has even been written in a nice sort of, I'm not going to obsess about this, but sorry, I'm mildly going to obsess about this. It looks like it's been written in that kind of handwritten list on a fridge kind of way and slotted in So it's like almost in a text box. It sort of floats into the document. And it says the usual stuff like, change your light bulbs. It doesn't say change your light bulbs. It says fly less, take the train, use Skype. And there are 10 things called KBAs, which are key behavioural areas, if you like, which could map across to housing, transport and agriculture, but don't really. Because the agricultural concern, as Clive, I think, said, is largely around the impacts of agricultural production. There's jack all to do with consumption. The consumer is missing. Yeah? We model the emissions of the inputs into the agricultural process. And if we are able or are prepared to regulate about those inputs, then emissions will drop. The fact that people consume these things and farmers produce things in order that people can eat them is overlooked, I guess. So here I just was wondering what might happen if we did start from the ISM end of this seesaw rather than the UK Times end of the seesaw. Yeah? What might a climate plan look like? So I'm going to do 3 behaviours which relate to housing, transport and agriculture. And this one this is the housing one, and we call this installing solid wall insulation. You're all welcome to gather around if you can't see from where you are. If anybody's online, they should be able to see very clearly. Here's this, and I get my apology in early. This is how I drew the model, and this is how I always show it. Those of you who are familiar with it from the publications in Scotland will see something totally different. It just looks a tiny bit different. The head's been turned round and recoloured. And anyway, yes, I didn't say the jelly baby model. So this is the phrenological head model. This is a much more serious, thoroughgoing affair altogether. Right, so if we think about so what happens here is we use the model, which has got 18 labels on it from a load of different disciplines, which have then been sort of synthesised into one piece of paper, and we gather around a table and we talk about a behaviour. And we identify and we map our understanding of the behaviour onto the model. And it helps us identify which of these factors and influences are weighing on the behaviour. Yep. So here's one I did earlier, if you see what I mean. What you really get is you get one version for the individual, one version for the social, one version for the material. But this is like a highlights potted version. So in terms of the individual here, when we're thinking about installing solid wall insulation, this is what we did in Scotland with the government. Well, from an individual point of view, it ain't so great. It's an horrific experience, said a government employee who'd had the pleasure of installing solid wall insulation. But this speaks very much to what Catherine was talking about uncertainty around climate change. People don't know. Even if we go down to the level of behaviour, people don't know. People don't know what doing solid wall insulation involves, and they don't know whether it's going to be worthwhile. What they do know is it's horrific. Okay? In the social dimension, it's a very hard behaviour to have traction on. Lots of these in-home behaviours, like turning down your thermostat, are really, really hard to have social traction on, apart from within the family unit, as work on smart meters is finding, where what smart meters really do is kick off a whole load of family arguments about who's left what on for too long, and how long your daughter's in the bath, right? But it's very hard to energise norms, to lever social norms around something that happens in your home. Talking to neighbours, relationships, that's going to be one way of saying, actually, it wasn't horrific. Do you know what I mean? And I am getting the benefits. My house feels better already. The role of the EPC assessor is just critical as well. I had the debatable pleasure of an EPC assessment, and the guy said, you live in a stone-built home, there's almost nothing you can do. You could, and I said, oh, solid wall? And he went, yeah, if you want to lose a foot off all your rooms. I was like, you're the EPC assessor. Thanks. There's a lot of stuff in here about meanings. ISM is careful to highlight meanings in the social space. I mean, kind of on the boundary between the social and the material world, if you like. We're slightly in control of them and slightly not, as your cycle of comms suggested. These meanings are co-constructed. But the gap between a home as a place of comfort and a building as a thermal space to be engineered is quite large. Yeah? And that's the misunderstanding of that, if you like, is one of the reasons the experience of solid wall insulation is so horrific. because I have a bunch of workmen who come and wreck my house, traipse through it with their muddy boots, eat me out of house and home, and I effectively have to move out of that space in my house. So this is best done as part of moving house. Yeah? So we need to think how this practice joins with other practices. You know, offering somebody the opportunity to move out of their living room while living in the rest of the house while having the builders in isn't that attractive. Especially if you're not sure whether and when this is going to pay back. Okay. So there's a mixture of things of how we could drive solid wall insulation forward. Here's another one. So this is transport, and the climate change plan makes a big thing of how we're going to have electric vehicles, and that will remove, I think, fossil fuel vehicles from the road. I mean, France have actually just announced they've legislated to do this. I think they've set a date, 2030 or something, by when there will be no more fossil fuel cars on the market. But I guess that's because they partly own the means of production in France, so they can do that kind of thing. But that's certainly the intention here. Now, how, it's all very well saying, let's have electric vehicles. How are we going to get those savings? And they're a big line in the Scottish Times model. How are we going to get those savings out of electric vehicles? Because last time I looked, in fact, last night when I looked down by the multiplex in the middle of Stirling, there were 2 electric charging points and there wasn't an electric vehicle in sight. So here we are in the individual world. Well, it's not horrific. There is anxiety. There's this technical thing called range anxiety. There is anxiety among the public, but there's also just tons of uncertainty. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who lives in Berlin, who's got an electric vehicle, and he said he's just spending all his time at the moment driving it around to work out what it costs and what it doesn't cost. He's like this Uber calculator about when shall I fill it up, and when do I drive uphill, and when do I drive downhill, and am I saving money? He does not know. It's very hard to work out even when you own one. So it's fair enough for people to say, why would I scrap my fuel vehicle to move to an electric vehicle? Lord knows. The good news in electric vehicles is that social norms are just brilliant. And one of the things you find is that anybody who's got one immediately goes, you must get one, they're absolutely brilliant. And so we were talking about ways of doing car sharing and getting people to try other people's electric vehicles, because they will spread virally in that sense without any trouble at all. They are in a sort of diffusions of innovation model. You know, they have competitive advantage. They are an innovation. They're damn good in that sense as a driver's experience. They're not great if you're a cyclist, you can't hear them coming, but from a driver's point of view, they're pretty fantastic. There's this phrase, once driven, forever smitten, you're probably familiar with from an advertisement, and that certainly seems to be the case with an electric vehicle. But it's also the case that the relationship between cars and advertising is really, really strong. Really, really strong. Cars are... The whole meanings thing around cars is what makes it so difficult to achieve change in car ownership. People with no money take out debt they cannot really raise to drive a very large Land Rover Sport. And I can point to you to little bits around the periphery of London where this has just happened immensely. And your precise car choice says loads about who you are. People have little names for their cars, they personalise their number plates, the whole thing. And the meanings of electric vehicles are very, very contested. So when we did this work in 2013 with the government, we had the choice between the Sinclair C5 and the Tesla, neither of which, as far as I'm aware, are mass market vehicles. Right? The Prius began to enter the conversation as the thing that government ministers working in environment departments drive, or have their bag carrier drive while they cycle. They used to queue up outside DEFRA. There was a line of black Priuses. Extraordinary. And then now we've got the BMWs, which are maybe making it a more both attractive and mass market option. And I just saw something on the Frankfurt Motor Show, which has got Mercedes as electric cars all over it. So it's happening, if you like. But it is being driven in a large part through that same frame of, what do we call that? Competitive social conversations around culture, Veblen's conspicuous consumption. You know, we're still in the same frame, and we've attached that to electric vehicles. So we can still have our consumer choice and consumption and competition, but in the context of that market. One of the interesting things about the market for electric vehicles is how they're financed. I mentioned, taking out it's almost impossible to buy a car without finance nowadays. I don't know if anybody's tried. You have to take it out and then pay it back the next day. They will not sell you a car for cash. You have to buy debt. Ditto batteries. Batteries are the expensive thing in the car. You lease the battery. We're very much back to the world of Henry Ford and Henry Ford didn't invent the car, he invented financing. Yeah? Daimler-Benz invented the combustion car, but Henry Ford supplied the financing. And that's the thing that made the innovation take off. Right? So one of the things we need to understand about technologies is they are socio-technical arrangements. They're not techno fixes. You don't just whack a line in a budget and say, this technology is going to deliver me these savings. Yeah, they're socio-technical. People have to use the dratting things. Yeah, that's why the internet's turning out to be something that your man's not very comfortable with. What's he called? Tell me. Who invented the internet? Tim Berners-Lee. Yeah? It's not great. I know why he did it, how he did it, but he's not finding it that useful. So one of the things down here about adopting electric vehicles is journeys. The thing is, people use vehicles for purposes, and purposes are journeys. Right? Now, there's range anxiety, but half of all journeys are less than 5 miles. Half of all car journeys are less than 5 miles. But people don't think about that. They think of long journeys. Yeah? And I'm very, very tempted to raise Ivan Illich. I'm always tempted to raise Ivan Illich, but he said something lovely about cars, which is the car creates distances that only the car itself can transcend. Yeah, they're constructions that lock us in. They're tools. He would call it a tool for productivity. A bit like I would have to fly because I need to beat the train. I have to take the train because I like being beaten by people who fly. But it doesn't mean I missed yesterday's presentation. Right, next. Last one. So this is called agriculture. And I'd like to talk about eating. And one of the things we need to do is eat more plant-based protein, right? If we're going to live within these emissions envelopes. It's been calculated that if we all eat as much meat as we're eating and continue to do so as populations grow, we use the whole of that 2-degree carbon envelope, in the popular parlance, by 2050 from meat production alone. That'll take the whole lot if we keep going as we're going up to 2050. So this is something that needs doing. In terms of the individual, the good news is that people understand, particularly from a health point of view, that eating too much red meat is not great for you. I think probably even Americans living around the corner from the burger joint understand that it's not great for you, and they're probably the worst offenders per capita. The bad news is that food is just 100% habit. I mean, it's just, sorry, that's a lie. It's 96% habit. I'll give you a 92%. Have a number. Because food is identity and food is habitual, even physiologically, there's this thing called the familiarity effect. If we eat something and it is good, we like it. Therefore, next time we taste it, it gives us satisfaction. So eating things you've never eaten does not give you liking. Yeah? So you become attached to foods that you have eaten in the past, particularly in your childhood, heritage foods, and on it goes. It's very, very hard to turn away from that because we are what we eat, and not to eat it would make us something other than we are. Okay? So when we get onto meanings, there's a whole load of work here. Claude Fishless famously written, "Food not only nourishes, it also signifies." Food is like the most meaning-laden thing there is. And the tension between meat as the dish for men, says Bourdieu, strong and strong-making for men who have second helpings, versus what it means to be a vegetarian, to say you're a vegetarian. I mean, gender is just the beginning of this. But there's large discourses of power, thank you for mentioning that earlier, Clive, around meat and veg. Yeah? And again, if we think back to the car and the financing, it's noticeable that when we get onto the infrastructure, the fresh veg market, fruit and veg market, is not great. I don't know if you've been to a one-stop lately, but it's not that good. But they've got every kind of hot dog and burger and sausage you could possibly want. And in terms of gross value added products, biscuits, cakes and confectionery are the number one. That's where you make your most profit if you're a supermarket. Processed meat products are number two. Yeah, so nobody wants to give up. The system does not want to give up on processed meat. Yeah, so that's why it's available, it's cheap, it's convenient, and that's where we're stuck with. I had a really interesting day with a guy from Quorn and Quorn are hoping to crack that. You see, there's not a lot of profit in cucumber, but there's quite a lot of profit in processed mushroom-based protein that you can repackage. And again, like the Mercedes or the BMW, this allows us to remain competitive because it's profitable. It's processed plant-based protein, it delivers profit, we can package it, it's branded. And he said that what makes their products perform well is that they substitute for meat products. So a Quorn sausage performs like a meat sausage. And if they can perfect that in the lab, then they know they're onto a winner. Because people want substitution, they don't want transformational change. Right. Quick, implications of ISM. Now, we sort of knew these for RPP2, I think, but they're becoming increasingly clear, and this is where the next guide needs writing. You work in multiple contexts. You have to think about the individual, the social, and the material when you're devising your intervention. That involves bringing in multiple people. We've heard about all kinds of people, EPC assessors, car dealerships, your next door neighbour. There's all kinds of people we've just mentioned. All of those have got a stake in this. Bring them together around an understanding of a behaviour. Work on the hard and the soft infrastructure, like the physical stuff, but also the ideas, the meanings, the schedules, the rules and regulations, as implied in your successful story of banning smoking, if you see what I mean, or limiting smoking. And we don't necessarily need to target individuals. None of this is why it's called Beyond the Individual. I don't have to go around telling people to eat more plant-based protein. I just need to make plant-based protein more available to people. But if we are thinking about people, ISM would argue that we ought to think about groups and roles and social dynamics and families. And I'm just going to end with some ironies, which are probably a little bit more provocative, and these point to what RPP3 needs to think about. There's an irony here, which is the more we're getting towards 2032 and it's getting more difficult, individuals become more important, but the response of government is to revert to number, right? Because government governs through number. Basically, they like the Treasury likes pounds, and there was a moment when it was said, I think by George Osborne, that CO2 would become as important as pounds in the budget. He said it once. I don't think he said it again, and it was probably now 6 years ago. So, as I understand it, the challenge is to get policymakers now here in Scotland to count carbon, not pounds, and that's what's going on, and that's a very, very valid and important thing to be doing. The problem is that people don't count carbon, apart from freaks like ourselves. You know, how bad is a banana? That's Tim Berners-Lee's brother wrote that. So we need to enable government to do that, but not lose sight of the public, of the people that are going to deliver these numbers. There's an irony in here that the precise areas of sectors and processes that are being highlighted, particularly housing and transport, are ones where people have very little agency. Yeah, you live in the house you're given. This is the housing stock, if you see what I mean. You've precisely picked the areas where people don't have very much choice. All they can do is drive in a different gear. Yeah, because of where they live and the way that life is constructed. Eating needs to be front and centre, because food production is responsible for as many emissions as transport, full stop. 15% of all emissions. Food and transport are equal. Rather than targeting individuals with interventions and lots of comms, let's transform everyday life, including changing the meanings that are out there in circulation, including in the media. And this is not just a challenge to governments. This is like the RPP2 position, is behaviour change isn't just a challenge to individuals, you go and eat your greens. Yeah? It's a challenge of governance, getting institutions to draw the system together to make the change that helps people, within which people can act. Yeah? But in particular, I would point in RPP3 to saying that this is just the beginning of the role of government as governance. If you like, it's a governance challenge now, is thinking seriously about how to take individuals with you rather than throwing a bunch of targets out there. And I think building these kinds of communities, and the Climate Challenge Fund does it somewhat, I think, trying to get into communities and have these conversations and help people debate, discuss, learn for themselves what are the things that need to be doing, what 2030 is going to look like, is a task for people themselves in communities, and with local government and national government above that. All right, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Stimulating as ever, and thanks to both speakers for really kind of stirring up what I hope will be for the next 20 minutes, 25 minutes, a really stimulating debate. There was, loads of things there that I think connected your two talks. You're raising at the end there questions about governance and involving people and making climate change and decision making relevant to people. I guess there's a really fundamental question about to what degree do we need to change the political economy and the more participatory governance system to create the conditions in which we can address issues like climate change and I would say the state of nature in there as well, in terms of an ecosystem approach which is centred on involving people in decision making about how we use natural resources. So I think there's a really, you're both, I think, scratching at a really profound question about what kind of society we live in and how we participate in that to make decisions about things that affect us. And I think the issue of choice is a really interesting one that again cut across both of your presentations in terms of the extent to which we feel or we're led to believe as citizens that we have a free choice and it's all down to us to make that choice. But there are so many structural controls and kind of invisible controls, what you might call propaganda in all sorts of ways that shape the decisions that we make and the choices that we make. So I hope the questioning will kind of pick up on those and other threads that have come up. I'm not seeing anything on the webinar, so for those of you watching online, please email your questions in. But other than that, we'll start in the room. Oh, I've seen 4 hands go up. So, so I've got what June?
Follow the mic.
Follow the mic. Eve first.
Hi, thanks very much, Andrew. You mentioned transformational change being unwanted or difficult for people, and so I was wondering to what extent you think that might be to do with a resistance to change itself, an inertia, rather than a rejection of another destination, if you like.
Totally. Change inevitably brings loss. It does. And if you have status, the risk is that you lose status. Yeah. If you like your life, and most people, I think, even when lives are pretty tough, people find ways of thinking that their life is acceptable because otherwise it becomes unendurable. But we'd all like more of something. Might be more of less, but we all yearn, and on a very deep level, we have to understand that change is uncomfortable, and that people need an arm round them. I think, because asking me what the future looks like is a hard question to answer, because whatever I tell you is you're either going to immediately disagree because you feel differently and your idea is going to be as good as mine, or you're going to reject it because you don't like what I say. But if we co-construct it, then it'll work out fine.
Okay. I have an ancillary question, if that's right, which goes back to what Catherine was talking about. We were talking about our predispositions.
No, I think so, yeah.
Right. Thank you. So following on from that then, linking back to what Catherine was saying about a predisposition to believe some arguments and reject others, and our use of social media. You were talking about social media as a vehicle of change. My understanding of our habits around social media is that we find like-minded people rather than those with whom we might disagree. So the opportunities for those conversations to co-construct, we're almost limiting ourselves already by only seeking out the company of those we agree with. So I suppose the question is, how do we break through that? What what can we offer as an ambition or a positive destination to drive or create a bit of change that way?
I mean, I agree with the point about social media completely. And as I said before, I mean, talking about it in a positive way is quite a rare thing for me. I think we have an incredibly polarised political and social culture now, and actually social media to a degree is a mechanism that is driving that. And I think we've seen that very clearly in our political outcomes in recent times, both Brexit and Trump. Examples of a move away from what we used to have, which I feel is a kind of mainstream culture which sits in the centre ground, and lots of people disagreed with it and there was debate and engagement in the middle, to really a very polarised two sets of mainstreams, if you like, one in which is sitting very much, you know, to the left, and one is sitting to the right, to maybe put it too simply. And I think climate change, as I say, I think it's different probably across the US and the UK, but is very indicative of where we sit in that kind of polarised political culture. But I think if you take the UK case, one of the big problems with climate change, and it's probably more of a problem in terms of our attitudes towards it and the way we feel about it, is that most people don't care enough. I think I said that at the start. So what I do feel with climate change is that you do have an extreme of opinion here and you have extreme of opinions here, but actually there is that group in the middle who are really not connecting with it at all. They probably are broadly sympathetic. So in that respect, in terms of the potential for co-constructing a conversation or a dialogue or winning people over, I would say on climate change here, Scotland, UK, actually there is great potential for that. They've got a much bigger battle in the US, but here, I really feel the problem is that actually people don't really have a position on it at all. We do, and we're sitting here, and some people are very, very sceptical and very predisposed to disengage with it or reject what they're hearing from the scientists. But I would say the majority of people aren't. The big problem is that group in the middle who aren't engaging at all. And actually, I think they're quite winnable on this subject. So I agree with you, it's a problem if you're in a social media culture where you're not receiving any kind of positive messaging. But I'm not convinced most people have placed themselves on climate change quite yet with that. Also, there is a real marginalisation of scepticism here in the UK, and I think that's changed a lot since I started this work, even in the last 6-7 years. Actually, when you do groups, I think initially when I started, and it maybe be, you know, there'd be, I don't know, maybe a third of the group would be very, very sceptical. If you have somebody who's very sceptical now, people kind of shout them down. So there has been a shift. There's definitely been a shift, and actually even coming back to the US, most polling shows that the majority of Americans do believe in anthropogenic climate change. Now, politically, they might agree with, I don't know, open up the coal plants like Trump suggested, but that's about short-term interests again. That's actually not really anything to do with the science. But yeah, I agree with the point, absolutely.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi. Is this on? Yeah. I actually have questions for both of you, but I'll start with Andrew, I guess, and see how you go. So one of the things that I love about ISM is the fact that it really, you know, it digs in and kind of highlights that tremendous complexity of factors that influence behavior. But I always kind of wonder, how do we then coordinate that into policy, and how do we prioritize action? You know, it's great at, highlighting all these things, and it's fascinating, but I always struggle with, okay, where do we go from there, and where do we start? It's so multidisciplinary, it's so complex. So how does that translate into policy?
And that I think is the blunter way, or turning back on me the question of what does a guide for RPP3 look like? What do we need to do some of these things to introduce governance systems? And I guess that's how I think of ISM as, I'm a big lover of sustainable development. I don't know if anybody's mentioned it yet, but I quite like it. And I understand it to be a way of governing, ideally the whole planet, based on trade-offs and negotiations. And that's how I understand ISM in practice. Is it's a means of governing, or it's a social object we create. And the point is that those maps, I don't sit and write those. This is why I like the description of me as an architect of ISM. If you see what I mean, I've given the plan, but the building takes many hands, and even, you know, urban chimps who hang off scaffolding with their backsides hanging out. All kinds of people will be involved in the building.
There's quite a transition in governance required, I think, in the way that we govern.
I think there is.
In the first place, before
I
we
think
can
there
even
is, but we're beginning to
use
see this.
ISM for governance.
I took part in something that the National Lottery, the big lottery fund, ran called The Future of Doing Good, which was like a conversation across the third sector. And the big message from the lottery was, we've just got to collaborate. And I think we're beginning to see, and Clive, in your world of what used to be called conservation and is now called, natural resource management or something, it's about working at landscape scale, and it's about multiple actors coming together first to decide what is good.
It's a slow process.
What is good
steps,
in a landscape? What do I want this to look like? I'm not getting an expert to write it for me. I live there. Yeah? And then we co-design interventions that we can work with. And the role of government at different levels is to provide governance systems, if you like. And ISM is a tool that can help run a governance system for helping people think about how to come together and change a behaviour. So I'm dead sorry it doesn't say one from the top row, two from the second row. Those have to be socially negotiated.
Yeah.
And I think I should spell this out. The guide doesn't say anything about this. So I'm sorry, my debt's to you.
We've got a question online, so we'll go to that one first. For Andrew, how do you put your arm around a whole workforce when driving change in an organisation?
Have really big arms, of course. Or it's like, how do you eat an elephant in small pieces?
Yeah.
Okay, there we go, we've done that one.
Yeah. And if lots of people are putting their arms around each other, they might connect up as well in some way.
Yeah, I mean, there's a load of stuff, having been slightly silly, there's a load of stuff about system leadership and what it means to govern in a complex system. And it isn't about one guy in the middle saying, I love you all. And nobody believes that stuff. I mean, I think that's the problem with the expert thing. When you pull back the curtain, there is no guy playing the organ. I'm really sorry. And we're about to have a population of 11 billion people by 2050. There's quite a lot of people who can play organs. I hope they do.
Thank you. Okay, I agree. I mean, I think there's a big question in there about ideas around leadership as well, the kind of Churchill style versus a more distributed sense of common purpose and shared purpose and that sort of common cause. Okay.
We're all experts in our own landscapes.
And then we're complete idiots as soon as we step outside it, which isn't usually very far.
That's fine, but we don't have to run the system. We just need to run our patch.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But
I think in terms of leadership, one of the problems that we do have at the moment, as I said, there is a real suspicion of experts and the people that we hear from in the public sphere. And I think it's really because I think we are in a time of great change. And actually one of the problems is that, the story of neoliberalism actually is it's no longer as solid as it was. We're not buying into this anymore. We're told about things like trickle-down economics and the wealth at the top will benefit all of us. Actually, people are not believing that anymore. I almost feel, and this is where journalism's in, really difficult times, because there's almost been a kind of demystification of journalism, the idea of objectivity being exposed, which is a real problem, but journalism is that filter for an awful lot of people, or media producers or different forms of media, for the messages that we get from the leaders at the top. And unfortunately, the messages we get, there's now this huge gap between people's real experiences and what's going on in their lives and what is being said to us. We're not buying into it anymore, and I think that is the reason Trump was elected, and I do think it's one of the reasons. There are lots of different reasons, but I think actually the only positive thing to say from that is that we might be at a time perhaps when there is potential to kind of tell a new story, because people are sick of the old one. It's not working and they're not buying it. So how can I in terms of radical transformation in the way we live, clearly that's something that takes time and is done in increments and so on and so forth. But I think perhaps there are opportunities opening up, because those stories just, the narrative isn't working for most of us anymore. There's a real sense of discontent, for some people a real rage, which Brexit showed. And so I think, our leaders can only lead if they're talking our language, if they're completely disconnected and they're telling us things that are, actually that says nothing to me about my life, GDP and things. I don't care about that. Tell me whether I've got a job. I think leaders they really have to think about that, because we do have this huge gap between the people at the top and the people at the bottom.
So I'm glad you sort of finished the point on that note, because there's another question online which kind of follows on from that quite nicely, and I think it's kind of a question for both of you, but it's quite long, so I'm not going to read it all out. But it's getting at the way that NGOs contribute to this debate. So the question is kind of proposing that NGOs mainly kind of contribute to this debate through the kind of high level and abstract conversation about overall targets. And then follows on, is that because it's too hard for even the NGOs to engage people to raise their expectations of government and the actual real world changes?
Let you go first on that one.
All right. I wrote something called Finding Frames with the guy who was campaign director at Oxfam, which caused something of a ripple in the development NGO world. And some of them took it on, and some of it's all about framing and meanings, and how the way that global poverty is constructed by the NGOs disempowers the public, effectively. It's the Live Aid legacy. It's all still broken. Sorry, you want me to give you more money? But I've been giving you money since 1985. You guys must be corrupt. You know, you reap what you sow, and chuggers particularly reap it on the street, in the front line. And one of the things, Oxfam were the best of the NGOs. I won't name the worst. And they took it really seriously. But because they're in a competitive environment, people didn't feel they could move their communications. Because if I stop doing Flies in the Eyes fundraising and somebody else keeps doing Flies in the Eyes fundraising, they're going to have my donations off me. But one of the things that Oxfam were afraid to do was, I suggested that for their 50th birthday, they might just invite people who'd ever been a member of Oxfam to meet for tea round at somebody's house locally. And this was scary. I mean, it's a totally distributed model of leadership in a complex system, and it was totally scary because the centre wants to be the expert, and the role of the member is to fund the centre. Friends of the Earth is a slightly different organisation. We can talk about that another day. But broadly speaking, the NGOs want to keep the status and the expertise in the centre, and you can join their campaign. They're not social movement organisations.
So that's quite interesting, because a lot of NGOs would frame themselves as social movement organisations. But and I think that kind of trips into something that Catherine was saying earlier, that if the way in which issues and problems like climate change are framed by government then draws people in to try and influence that debate on the basis of that framing, then they're almost by default sucked into reflecting back the same framing, as opposed to alternative points of view that actually might be more about the lived experience of those events.
I think, I mean, my experience of working with NGOs is that it's a real struggle to develop a relationship with government at the same time. There's NGOs and there's NGOs, but in my experience, you know, a lot of what they want to do is work with governments and to inform policy, and in a very positive way. But there's no question, if you come back to the perception of the people at the bottom, that a number of the NGOs actually have become part of the problem, because it's very, as an academic, it's sometimes quite difficult to get to government. You have to go through an NGO or a think tank, or actually they should speak directly to us, but they really, really don't. So they almost kind of are that filter layer, and so they do move into that world where they're talking that language, and it's being at the table at the top. And when you're at the table at the top, you've got to compromise, because you've got to speak the language of the table at the top. And so there's a real, you know, there's NGOs and there's NGOs, I probably would say that. And so it's, but in my experience, you know, there's got to be some compromise if you want to be there, if you want to be influential, and that's probably why some academics are cut off from that, because they won't compromise in the work that they do.
Can I just, I note that this question is from Raggy, sorry, because I'm reading your thing. So hello Raggy, shout out. It's like being on a pirate radio station. Great, haven't done that for years. I would also just give the example of there's a friend of mine who's well up in the Labour Party, and they spend the whole time agonising about momentum. Yeah, momentum is in danger of splitting the Labour Party, if it hasn't done it already, right? And it's a row over styles of governance. Yeah, there's a whole load of people out there who are largely self-mobilising through social media. Jeremy Corbyn can get a massive crowd at the drop of a hat in any town, and the Labour Party don't know what to do in terms of mobilising that into a recognisable parliamentary-driven negotiating and governing machine.
It doesn't fit.
It
doesn't
do-
But they
compute.
certainly
It
have to work
doesn't-
with it because it's been so incredibly successful.
Right, but where's policy going to come from, right? And this is where we're at. That's what the NGO faces likewise.
I should go to another question. I was going to ask something about command and control administration, but maybe we should come back to that in a moment. June. And then was a question.
Hi. Loads and loads of stuff, but I'll try and confine to... I don't know if it's a question that's got an answer. We've heard a lot about status and agency, and I think it's almost like they're flip sides of the same coin to some extent. And the thing about people, whether it's organisations or individuals that have status, they want to maintain that status quo. And I was listening to a podcast. It's high up in one of the big advertising marketing agencies. And he was talking about things like a lot about things about framing and meanings and things like video conferencing, which I've used sometimes with ISM, trying to get people not to travel. And he was saying in video conferencing, if it was marketed as the poor man's British Airways, instead of being the rich person's meeting, and if you charged it much higher and all these kind of things. And the thing, we've done some work with marketing professor at Heriot Watt, and he has said previously in events we've had that we're hardwired for status, which we are, because it's a thing about it's basically down to, is this a threat or is this an opportunity? And I'm just sort of thinking, and again, I don't think there's a pat answer, but how do we, the values thing that was mentioned, and a lot of marketing, advertising, which we're all subject to, and we just kind of accept the good citizen stroke consumer. And that all primes the sort of self-interest values. So how it's this thing, how do we get this flipped round? And even social media, the majority of social media, a lot of it is around, selfies showing off who I am, where I am, what a great life I'm leading. We know that's not true. But I'm just interested, how do we flip that? Because there's always somebody at the top and there's always somebody trying to scrabble over. It's you have status within organisations. We have it in here. How do you get the agency, the shared, distributed status?
Who wants to go first?
I don't know, it's a really, really hard one because there's a real conflict in terms of trying to promote particular behaviours and how much you work within the ideology that's already there. So even though I did previously say that neoliberalism is under attack, let's be honest, it's still a system in place. It's still in the idea of individualism and bound up with which is our identity and all the rest of it. And I wonder if this is a very cynical approach, but you work with the language that you have to encourage people to take up the actions that you want. So is there a way in which you appeal to the individual and appeal to the individual benefits of particular behaviours, which then encourage a collective move which is positive? So for example, coming back to the point about meat consumption, when we did our research on meat consumption, actually most people, if you ask people to change their behaviours on meat consumption, because of the environment, are pretty resistant to that. They don't quite make that connection and they can't understand it. But then when you start to connect those arguments with health, which is really about benefits to the individual, that's when you start to talk to them. So actually that's when they sit up and they say, oh, I could do the environment on the side and also it helps with health. So, should we work with the language that we have? It's a genuine dilemma because people do respond to that, and unless you're talking about a whole ideological shift, which perhaps is coming and perhaps we can make happen, but it's not here today and it's not going to be here tomorrow, do we cynically work with, we kind of promote that vision and that way of thinking and talking to people? I don't know the answer, but I'm just putting it out there
Yeah,
that actually we speak to their identity in positive ways to get them to do things we want them to do.
And
Sounds very deceptive.
No. But it's pragmatic, and it's absolutely right. And yet.
I know.
You know, it's this is the Common Cause Finding Frames smash up. They were written at the same time, and you know, it's not Tom Crompton's view in Common Cause, but certainly the Dade and Rose view of values and motivating values is that you just take people where they're at and you do what you can.
Mm-hmm.
But as I was pointing out with the car analogy, we just get left in this kind of deeply competitive, individualistic situation that we're currently in. It's just that the cars are differently fueled. There's still too many of them, without a shadow of a doubt. If we're going to do that, we have to have a very clear journey plan for how we wean people off this and into something which is more collegiate. And I would take issue with your guy from Heriot Watt, June, I think, who says, you know, we're hardwired for status, is how you summarise that. I don't
think that's exclusively his.
No, I understand that, but I could also point you to... Yeah, I could point you to a chunky literature. Yeah, it's psychology. That is the view of a psychologist rather than a sociologist. And that's an observation. And I could point you to another literature which is referenced in Finding Frames, which says we're hardwired for empathy.
I think that's
Totally. And I'm just, one of the places I've been working just 2 days ago is Northern Ireland. We're about to start work in Scotland on the same programme, which is supporting nurses who are attached to pregnant teen girls for 2 years and visit them for an hour a week. And we're trying to work out the value that they add in this complex system to these people's complex lives. And one of the things that comes out of that is there's a literature emerging in child development, which is that the first 2 years, the first 1,000 days are critical to your formation physiologically. And the brain of a child who's neglected in the first 2 years is this big relative to the, literally you can see, it's not even where it fires, it's the size of the damn thing. It's how you develop. And attachment is vital to human development and survival. And it's a trick of the light that it's dog eat dog. I mean, these are dilemmas. These are the selfish gene, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there is a really important point in there, though, I think, about language. And as you say, we need to start with a language that relates to people where they are. But then I think there's an important question about where you then go with the discussion and opening up other viewpoints and so on. Otherwise, there is a huge risk that the language that we use simply reinforces the narratives that lead to the problem in the first place. We're kind of running out of time a little bit. I've got 2 questions in the room. This is a shout out for those of you on the webinar. A sort of 5-minute countdown to get your questions in. But 2 more questions in the room here.
Okay, my question is about behavior. Don't you think that the problem about changing behavior is that you are talking about difficult things to do, but you are not focusing in the real value of you changing the behavior? For example, if you buy a garment for £5, what is the real cost of that garment? The chain, rather than you saving £5. And also things like, for example, in the UK are talking about the lack of housing. Everybody's talking about building more houses. Nobody's talking about why is a lack of available housing. We are focusing in the money value of things rather than the moral value of things.
What a gift of a question that is. Thank you so much. Economists know the price of everything and the value of nothing. I'm not sure if that's true, but they're certainly interested in price and very uninterested in value. And these behaviour changes are positioned or experienced and felt as losses. Like I was saying, change is loss, right? They're also gains. And if we gave up our car or decided to buy an electric car with our next door neighbour, we'd find we enjoyed our journeys a whole heap more. We would be weller in every regard, and we would probably be more connected to the ecosystems of which we are naturally a part than we currently are. And then we start to build virtuous circles all over the place. So lots of my work at the moment away from ISM is about value and getting organisations to think about value, what matters. And it's always the case that the indirect value is bigger than the direct. So this programme with teen girls obsesses about them giving up smoking. The nurses aren't in the least interested in whether the girls are giving up smoking because they've got bigger fish to fry, to put it nicely. But if you get somebody to give up smoking, all of the things a person has to do to give up smoking generates so much more value than not smoking. Yeah, you have to change your lifestyle, you have to get fit, you have different timetables, you probably drink less. All kinds of great stuff happens. But we never talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I probably would say that actually an awful lot of people do know the real costs of that garment, that £2 T-shirt in Primark. What the real cost is those processes of production which lie behind it. Now, in the old Marxist sense, they used to talk about false consciousness and not thinking about that and not making those connections, and it was they don't know it, so they do it. And there's a philosopher called Zizek who said, actually, in the current age, we live in an ideology of cynicism, and so the new phrase should be, we know it but we do it anyway. So there are so many people, they know those exploitative relations of production when they're buying the T-shirt, but I come back to the point about short-term interest prevailing. If you're on a budget and you're going out on a Saturday night and everybody else is wearing those cheap dresses and they've got a new dress for every Saturday night, are you going to wear the old one? Short-term interest prevail because we're in competition with everybody else. We're in competition with people to get the best partner at the disco that night. So I think an awful lot of people understand. It's so true, though, isn't it? You know, we live in a culture of contradictions. We'll swap T-shirts afterwards. But you know, we live in a culture of contradictions. I mean, I go on the Guardian website, and the Guardian, you know, constantly goes on about climate change, and then, you know, adverts for bikinis and things. We do know a lot of this. I'm not saying everybody does, but do you not think people read articles about factories collapsing in Bangladesh, etc., etc.? But we don't want to know it. We want to continue living the life we live. And one of the reasons is because we're not so free to make those choices, because actually all of these other things come into it about identity and the limitations on choice and things. So I think in terms of the garment, I think an awful lot of people in the back of their mind know that garment has real human costs, but they're going to buy it anyway.
I think probably it's because you are being sold the idea that you can have it all.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
no cost related to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and technically it's not against the law either. So, okay, we've got two questions, but they'll have to be both quite quick. You first. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Alan Brown, I'm Development Officer for the Climate Challenge Fund, so thanks so much for plugging that.
No problem.
Yesterday we had an excellent presentation online which talked about the first phase we've gone through with RPP 1 and 2 being the low-hanging fruit, and we've done the easy things by shutting down big factories and smelters and that kind of stuff. And we're now into a kind of next phase, which is much more challenging. But I fear that we're not connecting across our sort of silos that we operate in, the local authorities, the NGOs, the communities, the corporate sectors. We've all got our own tools and resources to decarbonise, but nothing's joining us together across those frameworks. So we've got shifting normal for communities, but we've got ISM for local authorities. We've got a corporate strategy. We've got a media strand. Each person's still sitting in their silo, and I think this next wave requires us to cross those boundaries and to talk about local issues, what can be solved with the help of the community, the charities, the businesses, the local authorities, to solve problems at a local level. If we don't crack that nut, I think the next wave will be very hard. It won't be solved just by electrifying cars.
Okay, thank you. Evelyn, can I take your question as well, and then I'll let Andrew and Catherine answer.
Hi, I'm not sure whether this is a question, but it's something that for me is a pattern that's emerging from my personal life as well as my work life. So one is probably connected to social media and messaging and how to get messages across. I find that if a message or a piece of text or anything on a campaign is coming from me, I can see a pattern emerging. It almost gets no hits, no reads, no shares, very little that people take it seriously because it's coming from me. Then 2 days later, I maybe see it on Instagram done by a famous sports person or a famous actor or somebody who's very popular in the media and has a huge following. And all I have to do is repost it. No effort from me. And it gets huge amounts of shares and hits. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, it's exactly the same message. I feel like, banging my head against the wall and going, oh my God, can people not see it? It's the exact same text of reuse your plastic bags, or better yet, don't even have one, or don't create plastic waste that goes into the oceans. Or it could be such a simple message, beach cleanups, anything that people absolutely are aware and know about for many, many years. It's nothing new. So that's one thing that I struggle with, as in how to cross that bridge. In my personal life, I cross it by just reposting the message from the famous person, and I'm thinking, fine, I'll just use them as a tool. In my work life, I can't do that, obviously. Maybe I should and not tell anyone. But the other one that gets my head spinning is the one that's probably connected to the whole argument about the electric cars and everything like that Andrew was talking about. It's almost like I get asked to, we should be movers and the shakers, let's do something like an exciting project. And I usually say, yes, that's great. But nobody actually wants to take risks, because we can't possibly give them the answer of how much will this save and give them the result that's exact. That's it. Thank you.
Okay.
On the social media point, I think it's a mechanism by which messages are reinforced rather than original messaging can break through. And what you do find is that, I find this myself as well, if you've positioned yourself in a particular group, so say on independence in Scotland, you've positioned yourself with a group of people. If you generally agree with what's already getting said, or you kind of reinforce it and you're adding your support rather than ever challenging the group you're placed within, those messages don't have any traction whatsoever. You've positioned yourself already. In fact, you might find you get abuse if you try to stand outside of that. And of course, people are looking for some sense that it's okay to think this. So when a celebrity with loads and loads of followers, that gives a sense that it's acceptable to have this viewpoint, and we can all open up and we can. So maybe they saw your tweet and agreed with it, but I'm not quite sure yet what I think on this, because the social media collective has not yet given me where I'm supposed to position myself on this. I come back to the point I was making about occasionally when you're unsure, well, maybe more often for a lot of people, you're not sure what your position is on, say, a political argument, or I'll just look at my little group. They'll tell me what to think. I'll position myself with them. I know that's the right thing to think. It actually limits original thinking. I really, really think it does. So they were looking for the okay from the top to reinforce that message, and they probably agreed with you first time around, but they were looking round to see if it was all right to do that, really, virtually, obviously. And that, I think that's absolutely the way the media works. So it's very limiting, and also on Twitter and things, you're 140 characters, so you can't say anything nuanced anyway. But I do think that feeds into the polarisation that we were talking about earlier. There's no space to challenge the viewpoints of the group you're already in. You can challenge them over there. If you're a Brexiter, then great. You're agreeing.
And I think that raises some really important questions around self-censorship in social media,
absolutely.
and the structural controls that are actually affecting and influencing our choices in a very sort of subliminal kind of a way. So yes, powerful tool, but equally a double-edged sword in many ways. I can't. We probably haven't got time to pick up the point about localism, but I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's one of the challenges of climate change, is that it acts across a range of scales, from the very local, immediate places where we live our lives and work and so on, through to whole countries and obviously the whole planet in the end. And that's one of the. In a sense, it's an opportunity and a challenge. If it's relevant to everyone, there's something in there for everyone, but it's equally a challenge when you're having to act across all of those different scales at once and be consistent or coherent, if that's the requirement. So I feel that we could go on and on and on, and I'd love to, but we're going to have to shut down the webinar, I think, at this stage. So thank you all for tuning in. This has been, for me, a really, really great session, and I think it really emphasises that climate change, and I'd probably add the state of nature and natural resource management, because they're all the same thing, really, are very much part of the social interactions around them, the meanings that we draw from objects within those spheres of interest, matter hugely in relation to the potential solutions, and the way that technology as a fix, as a production fix, kind of plays into that. We obviously have to understand the way that people are going to interact with those technologies and join up the production of emissions with the consumption of emissions and get a coherent story around that. So thank you very much to the speakers, Catherine and Andrew, for generating such an interesting session. Thank you all for tuning in on the webinar. Thank you for coming, for those of you who are in the room, and see you on the next one. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.